Tonight, concealed documents. The Justice Department lays out a timeline over the classified information at the former president's Mar-A-Lago property in Florida.
It is possible that it could be an indictment from the Justice Department, but we don't really know that at this point.
Plus, inching closer to a nuclear disaster in Ukraine. And the job shortage. How not enough workers may be making opportunities and removing barriers for reformed criminals.
They're the ones that are going to show up to work. They're the ones that are going to actually go the extra mile.
All this and more on Faith Nation. A new wrinkle in the search on Mar-A-Lago. Welcome to Faith Nation. I'm Brody Carter. Well, we look at tonight a new revealing finding by the Justice Department where the feds believe former President Donald Trump and his legal team may have hidden classified documents to obstruct their investigation. Now, the DOJ has been looking into whether Trump improperly removed and mishandled classified documents after leaving office. CBN News senior Washington correspondent Tara Mergener has our top story tonight. Tara.
Brody, the Justice Department is responding to Trump's request for a special master, which is a third-party attorney who would oversee the agency's review of evidence gathered at Mar-A-Lago. The investigation is intended to determine whether those documents under lock and key in Trump's home are worthy of an indictment. The Department of Justice filing suggests that Trump and his legal team intentionally misled agents during efforts to retrieve documents. The 36-page filing provides new details into why the FBI took the unprecedented move to raid Mar-A-Lago, revealing a grand jury subpoena was issued in May for classified documents at Trump's estate, which Trump allies charge as government corruption at the highest level.
This is something that has never happened before. This is trying to turn America into a third world country. And I think that they have really miscalculated here.
While Trump insists he's cooperated with the investigation, the filing says government records were likely concealed and removed from the storage room at Mar-A-Lago. Efforts were likely taken to obstruct the investigation, and that some classified material was found in desks in Trump's office. Trump argues many documents seized belong to him and not the U.S. government. That's why he wants an unbiased third party or special master to go through them, hoping a decision will be made to remove private papers from the case. The Trump team making the case, he's protected by the Presidential Records Act, which gives a former president certain rights and limits access to the documents in the possession of the United States. Dr. John Vial agrees he may be protected, but...
And this filing that we got at midnight last night suggests that when the government got the prior records, no claim was made that he had declassified them, and there's nothing in the documents themselves apparently that would, you have another stamp that says, or declassified by order of President Trump.
DOJ officials claim Trump has no standing to request a special master review of documents based on privilege and insist there is no executive privilege because the documents belong to the U.S. government. A hearing is set this week for a judge to consider whether to grant his request.
Well, Tara Mergener, thank you very much for that insight. Here to continue the conversation is our very own CBN News chief political analyst, David Brody. David, first off the top, former Trump's attorney, Alan Dershowitz, says there's enough evidence to indict the former president. He went on to say, though, the Justice Department is unlikely to do so because of the, quote, Nixon-Clinton standards. So what do you think? Will the DOJ file charges?
Well, Brody, I think they want to file charges. I don't think there's any question about it. I think they're trying to figure out how to make the case specifically and airtight. That Nixon-Clinton standard is all about this idea that, with Richard Nixon, there were enough Republicans to say, look, enough, you're done. And that's why Nixon had to resign. It doesn't rise to that standard yet, obviously. But also on the Clinton part of that Nixon-Clinton standard, it's like, well, look, if the DOJ is going to go down this route, well, why didn't they go down the route with Hillary Clinton, with the 33,000 emails and the crushed BlackBerries and all of that? So I think there's a lot to consider here, because there is going to be huge, not just political fallout from this, but this is could change the nation overall, the trajectory of their nation, if the DOJ does this, indict a former president.
Well, David, you know you're getting close to an election season the more that you see former President Donald Trump in the news. And the saying goes, there's no such thing as bad publicity. So given all of this commotion surrounding the search and seizure of Mar-A-Lago, is this a boon or is this a bust for Trump politically?
Well, we're going to find out. I can tell you this, with the photo today, that's what I like to call it, the photo. This was a bust day for Donald Trump. Not a good visual op for the former president. Having said that, I think overall it's been a boon to him. Look, he can claim that he's the victim. Donald Trump, a victim? Well, he always thinks he's the victim. But if independents in this country, and obviously Republicans, but even some Democrats think, hey, the guy's not getting a fair shake and they're out to get him and it's another witch hunt, I think that makes Donald Trump actually even more, potentially more powerful and more I'm not quite sure of the word, but basically these independents there might actually be a little bit more sympathetic. I think that would be the word, sympathetic to him, and I think that's the key.
Well, President Biden announced his intent to run for a second term yesterday. He has a big speech coming up tomorrow night for the soul of the nation. All of this as the latest Quinnipiac poll shows Biden's approval ratings surging after hitting a low in July. So, David, is this speech going to give the Democrats a boost coming into the midterms?
Well, that's what they hope for, Brody. And there's been obviously some good news. Those gas prices don't start with a 5 number anymore. It's a 3, and so that's good news for them. And they've had some success recently. But I think what you're going to see with the Soul of the Nation speech is he's going to call out the extremism on the right. And what does that mean exactly? Well, he's been doing that for a while, but if you call the extremism out on the right a couple months before a midterm, it takes on a much different connotation. He's hoping to get independents. He's hoping to get some folks that are waffling on the Republicans, saying, you know what, we might not like the Democrats too much on the economy, but this extremism on the right with Trump is no good. And so he's hoping there will be more of an uptick for Democrats if he continues with that soul of the nation type speech.
What about recent Democratic legislative wins, David? Will Democrats be able to capitalize on items like student loan forgiveness and the new climate change bill? What do you think?
You know, it's a great question. Look, I think people get too wonky, right? I don't think people are going around every day going, boy, how's that climate change law going? I mean, they just don't think that. They think, oh, milk is up 25 cents. It's more that. So it's more about kitchen table issues. Look, we can have a discussion about climate change and whether or not the law is great, the law is bad. But I don't think voters are really thinking too much about that. Now, Gen Z might be thinking more about that. And as it relates to the student loan forgiveness, remember, this is a plan. A lot of people think it's illegal, so it's going to be challenged in the court. So there might be problems with that ahead as well. So I don't think there's any upside right now for Biden on that at this point.
CBN News Chief Political Analyst David Brody, thank you for your time tonight.
You bet. Thanks, Brody.
An urgent mission to avert a nuclear disaster in Ukraine. Inspectors from the UN agency Watchdog, tasked with ensuring the safety of a Ukrainian nuclear plant caught in the middle of fighting between Ukraine and Russia, arriving today. The Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant in southern Ukraine has been occupied by Russian forces and operated by Ukrainian workers since the early days of this 6-month war. Recently, the site was temporarily cut off from the power grid due to fire damage, causing a blackout in the region and increasing fears of a catastrophe. It's quite the mess. And joining us to talk about this is Anthony Ruggiero, Senior Director of the FDD's Non-Proliferation and Biodefense Program. Anthony, thank you so much for being on the show.
Thanks for having me.
Anthony, you and a group of bipartisan non-proliferation experts sent a letter to the Biden administration warning of a, quote, transnational radiological disaster. What's the worst case scenario here?
Right. FDD organized that letter. I mean, it's one of those things here in Washington. You know, we disagree on a lot of things, but bipartisan group of experts came together to highlight the issue. I mean, the worst case scenario, which it sounds like we came close to last week when the reactors, 2 of them, went offline from the electric grid, is, you know, some of the things that are worst nightmares on those of us who work in this field. And we've had other disasters like Chernobyl and Fukushima, but those were disasters. Those were not, caused by a country, namely Russia here, that is trying to use this as a nuclear shield against the Ukrainians, knowing that the Ukrainians cannot fire back, military against the Russian military that's there.
Well, it looks like those nuclear watchdogs that I'd mentioned earlier from the International Atomic Energy Agency, they are being allowed to visit the nuclear power plant despite Russian occupation. So what can they do to ensure its safety?
Right. The whole thing really was a back and forth because the Russians, of course, wanted the IAEA to go through Russian-controlled Crimea and Russian territory, which would have validated that the plant was a Russian plant, nuclear power plant. And of course, Ukraine was understandably upset about that because it should go through Kyiv, which the IAEA did. Now, they can bring spare parts. They can relieve some of the workers that are there. I mean, running a nuclear power plant is already stressful. We don't need the Russian military torturing and intimidating the workers. But to your direct question, what happens next? And a lot of countries have called for a demilitarized zone around the nuclear power plant. It's amazing that we even have to ask for this because nuclear power plants should not be used as a military base. I mean, that seems pretty obvious. Perhaps it's obvious to everyone except for Vladimir Putin.
Well, you'd mentioned relieve the workers. I do want to ask you here, Russian forces reportedly subject those plant workers to torture, interrogations. So what impact could that have on the actual safety of the power plant?
Well, these are workers that are trying to both avert a disaster based on what the Russians are doing around the plant. But then also, it is a stressful job. And so the last thing they need is to have their phones confiscated. That's one other thing that was mentioned. There's rumors that people have been killed or staff workers have been killed. They've been tortured by the Russians to see if there are any Ukrainian spies. But these are individuals who are just trying to make sure that the plant works, it works safely, and that an electricity gets to where it needs to go, and that despite really dire circumstances, that because an ecological and humanitarian disaster is not going to be contained to Ukraine, there are not walls around Ukraine that will contain the potential fallout. Russia will likely bear the brunt of it, as will other European countries, which is why this is such an urgent issue we need to address.
We're running out of time here. Very briefly, the infighting between the Russians and Ukrainian forces, they're blaming one another for continued firefighting in that region surrounding the power plant. Who's at fault here? Does it matter? And what's next?
Well, only one side is actually at the plant, creating it as a military base, and that's the Russians. And we have a long list of things, disinformation from Russia. So I'm not sure we should believe much of what they say.
Well, it certainly is a pleasure to have you tonight, Anthony. Unfortunately, that is all the time we have for this interview. Thank you very much for joining us, and we look forward to talking to you again next time.
Thanks for having me.
Well, coming up on the show, reformed criminals have a tough time getting into the workforce. Why the worker shortage in America is giving them new hope. Well, job openings are double the amount of available workers. This even as reworked job numbers from August show private payrolls slowing after a major gain in July. Job openings topping 11.2 million in July, nearly double the 5.6 million available workers in the U.S. Private payrolls grew by just 132,000 for the month of August, which is down from a gain of 268,000 the previous month. Now, the new numbers, they show increased annual pay up by 7.6%. It's a double-edged sword that could lead to an even higher inflation situation. Despite adding 3.8 million jobs in 2021, there are still a lot of openings in the workforce. As Charlene Aaron reports, this worker shortage is creating a unique opportunity for those with a checkered past.
At a time when companies are struggling to fill vacant positions, many have begun to consider sources they may have ignored in the past. Maybe they have considered this statistic. The unemployment rate for people with a criminal record is 27%, compared to the national unemployment rate of just 3.5%. At age 21, Jesse Weiss committed a crime that led to time behind bars.
I spent about 10 years in prison for armed bank robbery. Found myself really trying to find purpose in my life, chasing all the wrong things.
After becoming a Christian and attending Prison Fellowship Academy, Wies's life dramatically changed. After his release in 2006, Wies completed law school and today is a practicing attorney. He also works with Prison Fellowship, helping others like himself navigate the often difficult life on the outside.
There are housing barriers, employment barriers, barriers to purchasing a home, lots of different types of barriers, and that doesn't include kind of the social stigma that comes along with having a criminal record.
Devon Kelly of Newport News, Virginia, knows about that stigma. After 3 years in prison on a drug charge, finding work proved frustrating.
The first job I went to was Hardee's, and they denied me because I had a felony. Nobody never interviewed me if you just set the application in and you check the box that you was a felon.
Wies says the ongoing labor shortage created by the pandemic has opened up employment opportunities for those who have served time.
Fifth Third Bank, major corporations coming out and taking and encouraging other corporations to say, take a risk. We are seeing with this labor shortage more opportunities being afforded.
In 2018, Kelly was rehired as a shipfitter at Huntington Ingalls Newport News Shipyard. He now pays it forward by encouraging the company hire others like him, something he saw pay off at a recent hiring event.
And so these guys from the community, they heard about it, they came, and they was offered a job that day. These guys will be the ones that's going to make that company better if you just give them that one shot.
Wies says the work of removing barriers is far from over.
We need to make sure that now, since they're the ones that are going to show up to work, they're the ones that are going to actually go the extra mile. We need to make sure that that is sustained over time, and that's going to take an additional effort.
Charlene Aaron, CBN News.
They say a picture is worth 1,000 words. And when we come back, a new book reveals some of the oldest photographs of Jerusalem ever taken. An author and a photographer tell the history of the holiest city on earth in a new book. It contains some of the oldest photographs of Jerusalem ever taken. Their book also explains what Jerusalem Rising means in terms of biblical prophecy. Chris Mitchell has those details.
Author Doug Hershey uses past and current photographs to show the extraordinary transformation of Jerusalem over the past 175 years. The book continues Hershey's unique look at prophecy and the Holy Land.
Much like Israel Rising documented the revival of the land, Jerusalem Rising is documenting the fulfillment of, or at least the beginning processes of these biblical prophecies about Jerusalem being restored and what it's leading to.
Hershey and adventure photographer Eden Ram comb the city for just the right angles to capture its past and present.
Eden climbed up the top, there he goes. Looking at, you can kind of look through the fence here. It'll look better when you see the actual photos, but some of all of that stuff right in there is what he's getting a shot of from back in the early 1900s.
To be able to go to some of these locations and find the exact locations where a photographer set up 175 years ago to capture what Jerusalem looks like, and then go back today to the exact same location. Some of the oldest photos of Jerusalem ever taken were from 1844, and we have several of those in Jerusalem Rising, and all of those I don't think have ever been recreated ever.
One of those before and after photos takes place here, just outside the Jaffa Gate of Jerusalem's old city walls. It looks back from this spot towards what's known as the Tower of David. Hershey says most any city on earth may look different over the course of 100 years, but Jerusalem is unique.
There's no other city on earth that's had its history foretold, from its destruction to its desolation to a revival as a world player. So to be able to see all of that beginning to unfold in our day is really amazing. And so that's a lot of what's been documented in Jerusalem Rising.
Hershey says some of those prophecies can be seen on the streets here.
In Zechariah 8, God says that he's going to return to the city and he's going to dwell with his people, which is a profound statement for one of the prophets to say, that God's saying, I'm going to return to Jerusalem and dwell with my people. He says that the old men and old women will dwell safely in the streets, leaning on their canes, and the children will be playing in the streets, and the nations will begin to flood to Jerusalem.
And before COVID, Israel set records for tourism.
Never before in history have the nations flooded to Jerusalem the way that they are in our day. And now, clearly in Zechariah 8, it's in the context of coming to worship the King in Jerusalem, but it's undeniable that these are very beginning stages, historically, that we're seeing unfold in the city that have just never happened before.
Hershey says if we want to understand Jerusalem, we must look to the Scriptures.
Ultimately, if we continue reading the Scriptures, if we believe what the prophets said, Jerusalem is going to be a seat of ruling power for a Jewish king. Ezekiel 5:5 says that God has placed Jerusalem in the center of the earth. So locationally, it's already in the center of the earth. And one day soon, and even beginning now, it's already becoming the center of the world's attention.
A city that for thousands of years has stood at the crossroads of history and prophecy.
Jerusalem has been conquered and reconquered multiple times. It's changed hands over 40 times. It's been completely leveled at least twice. There's been literally hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years where the city has just laid desolate, according to eyewitness accounts. Now we're at a time where things are starting to revive. So prophetic words from Zechariah 8 or Isaiah or any of these prophets about Israel, about Jerusalem, where once we thought were allegorical or spiritual or just abstract concepts, we're finding that God is doing exactly what he said. Never before have these prophecies been fulfilled in such a dramatic and significant way, and it's happening in our day in a really powerful and unique way.
Chris Mitchell, CBN News, the Jaffa Gate, Jerusalem's Old City.
Remembering the legendary Soviet leader who oversaw the end of the USSR, his life and legacy, that's coming up. Finally tonight, former Russian leader Mikhail Gorbachev died Tuesday in Moscow at the age of 91. The Soviet leader, remembered as a man who helped bring the Cold War to an end. After President Ronald Reagan opposed the Soviet Union in the early 1980s, Gorbachev came to power. He brought about major reforms, and Reagan stood firm in talks with Gorbachev, and the two grew close. Then on June 12, 1987, President Reagan calling on Gorbachev during his infamous Berlin Wall speech.
Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall.
Well, we understand 6 months later, the two signed a major arms control agreement. The Soviet Union collapsed just a few years later, and many blamed Gorbachev. But outside his country, he was honored, being awarded the 1990 Nobel Peace Prize for helping end the long conflict between the Soviet Union, the U.S., and Europe. Well, that's going to do it for us tonight here on Faith Nation. We'll see you tomorrow.